On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the Federal Reserve cuts rates in response to trade tensions. Can upcoming trade talks calm the uncertainty? And Huawei unveils the 5G-enabled Mate 30. Will the phone's lack of Google apps affect global sales? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program in Washington, where trade talks have resumed between China and the US. The first face-to-face discussions in nearly 2 months kicked off on Thursday between deputy trade negotiators. They are expected to pave the way for higher-level meetings next month to resolve the 14-month trade war. Earlier, both sides made some concessions by suspending some planned tariffs in a sign of goodwill. Meanwhile, also in Washington, the U.S. Central Bank cut its key interest rate for the second time in more than a decade. Before we get down to our discussion about what all of this really means, let's take a look at this first.
Trade talks are back on between China and the U.S. This latest round sees deputy trade negotiators lay the groundwork for a high-level meeting in October. China's Vice Finance Minister Liao Min is leading the Chinese delegation of about 30 officials. Deputy U.S. Trade Representative Jeffrey Garish is head of Washington's team. The discussions are likely to focus on agriculture while also covering intellectual property rights. There has been a lifting of tensions earlier this month. First, China announced a list of American products that will be removed from the first round of additional tariffs. Then the U.S. delayed additional tariffs on imports from China that were due to be levied in October. And then China resumed its purchase of U.S. produce like soybean. During the past 14 months, the world's largest economies have put tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of each other's goods. The tensions have upended supply chains worldwide and curbed global economic growth. On Wednesday, the U.S. Central Bank cut its key interest rate to between 1.75 and 2%.
Trade policy tensions have waxed and waned, and elevated uncertainty is weighing on U.S. investment and exports. Our business contacts around the country have been telling us that uncertainty about trade policy has discouraged them from investing in their businesses.
The Fed also said it could cut rates even further if the trade war were to escalate. President Trump has pressured it to lower interest rates to accelerate growth. But this rate cut certainly wasn't enough. As Trump tweeted, Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve fail again.
For more on U.S.-China trade negotiations and the Federal Reserve interest rate cuts, we have in Shanghai Jimmy Zhu, Chief Strategist at Fullerton Research. Meanwhile, in Washington, we are joined by Joe Minarek, who is the Senior Vice President of the Committee for Economic Development. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Jacob Kirkgaard, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mr. Zhu, some suspension of tariffs from both sides. Good sign that there might be some kinds of at least a nice atmosphere to begin with. Mr. Zhu.
Yeah, I think the sentiment in the capital market is slightly more positive compared with the past few months. And even what we look at the economic data, actually, it shows that the market probably in the past few months is a bit too pessimistic. As what we see is the city economic surprise index is keep rising from the different regions. So that at least tells us the picture that, in the past few months, whether the pessimism on the trade talks our trade tension is too much. So moving forward, I don't think the trade deal can be reached in a very shortly, but for now, at least without any escalation at this moment, is a good news for the market.
Good news for the market already. Status quo, Mr. Kirkgaard?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that the markets are perhaps beginning to price in a standstill. I don't think anybody seriously believes that there's going to be a major breakthrough in these trade talks anytime soon. But I do think at the same time, people look at what's going on here in the United States and they recognize that President Trump needs better economic news as he heads into a re-election campaign. And if you look at the economic slowdown in China, as well as the upcoming 70th anniversary, the unrest in Hong Kong, I think it's pretty clear that the Chinese government as well has an interest in appearing to be in control, if you like, or having a process at least, which in the relationships with the United States.
Both sides need something about the stability in the economy. Mr. Minarik, but political will or the political picture is only one thing, but the very important nature of this relationship has very much in the center of discussion over the past 2 years since the trade war broke out. So what about that?
We have a difficult environment. The United States and China, of course, newly established terms of engagement back in the 1990s. There have been concerns about the extent to which, here in the United States, there's concern about China's adherence to the rules. China has been concerned about the United States showing an absence of understanding of China's circumstances. The nature of the discussions is difficult because the issues that are on the table are very hard to govern. Enforcement of the rules is tricky. This is a difficult negotiation, unlike what we have seen in recent years.
Mr. Zhu, now, if it is as difficult as all of you have beautifully illustrated, that there has to be something to begin with, Mr. Zhu, what do you consider are some of the things right off the fingertip of the deputy trade negotiators to pave the way for at least a negotiation, formal one, at the very beginning of October, as both sides have claimed to the outside world? Mr. Zhu, what is at the fingertip right now, the issues?
I think for now it's probably we can't be, no one should be very ambitious on, everything should be solved in overnight. But at least now I see some positive signs is, the people from the two deputies side, actually they start to work on the partial deals. If there's some partial agreement can be made, things whether can solve slowly. And also the both sides actually need to understand thing is, the monetary policy, even the fiscal policy, those kind of a stimulus probably may not be able to solve all these troubles because, the people's confidence is not here. But at least if the process start to moving and then let the people see that, the escalations is gone and the things that start to move into the normal levels, probably I think that's the best way to save the economy at this moment.
Yeah, we're not talking about saving the economies yet because both sides still have some maneuvering ground. What I'm talking about, Mr. Zhu, if you can, is some of the issues that the fingertips of the deputy trade negotiators that they at least could talk to one another, laying certain foundations for the eventual discussion, if there were any, in early October. Do you know anything, or do you think there's anything that they can, at this point, discuss?
There's some cultural difference, as earlier I hear, but I think from at this moment, when the both economy, are start to slow down, I think the very breaking through point is whether the two sides, can lift some tariff bans and the both sides actually start agree to buy some products from each other. I think that probably is the breaking point.
Okay, besides the suspension of the so-called threats of tariffs from one another on each other, what do you think, Mr. Kirkgard? What are some of the issues, immediate ones, that those sides can work on?
Well, I think basically what President Trump is looking for is a Chinese commitment to begin to buy more agricultural products. So they're basically looking for a dollar figure, preferably, of course, a large one. And clearly, on the Chinese side, I would imagine that the trade-off will be more tariff exemptions. We saw today that the Trump administration exempted, I believe, around 400 product categories for the new tariffs that were otherwise going to kick in later this year. I certainly believe that Beijing will be looking for more of those kinds of exemptions. So there is, in my opinion, a fairly straightforward trade-off of agriculture for exemptions, if you like, as an initial proprietary agreement, a small agreement, and then fundamentally the Trump administration will have to decide, is it willing to take the political risk of striking a relatively narrow deal centered around tariffs and agricultural products with China and leaving the really difficult stuff aside, and by that I mean the issues surrounding Huawei, IPR, and other sort of technological issues. I don't think that decision is made yet, but that's certainly what I'll be looking at in the next, looking for in the coming months.
Even though the ball can be in the court of the Trump administration, Mr. Millerick, on the other hand, the implementation of any deal, possible deal between the two sides, takes the implementation determination of both sides, and also certainly takes certain degree of trust at least. Now, both sides probably have to work hard in order to build that certain degree of trust. The Trump administration, no exception, given the previous issues, it seems that there is a lack of trust, particularly from Beijing toward Washington, about the immediate deals.
I believe that is true, and what we need, as you mentioned, there are substantive sides to these deals, and then there are questions of how they are implemented. The implementation part requires the United States having confidence and being willing to express that confidence in the willingness of China to comply. China has to believe that it is treated fairly and that the negotiations are at an appropriate level for two sovereign nations going together. That means that we're going to need an implementation process that allows some period of time for the demonstration of agreement and compliance with the agreement, and some fail-safe measures if it is determined that the agreement has not in fact been complied with. That's the tricky part, and putting those processes together is really a prerequisite for the two sides having enough confidence and trust that they would be willing to sign on.
But as you may know, Mr. Millerick, negotiators, what they can do is one thing. The other thing is about the jobs of the top leadership of both countries. Now, the trust between the two sides certainly have been exchanging some friendly remarks, but the eventual implementation of a deal takes really quite some degree of trust, even from the top leadership both sides. How will that be done on top of what the negotiators could do?
Well, the negotiators, of course, are talking at a technical level. They need to do their work well so that the foundation is built. But once that foundation is there, the leaders have to have confidence not only in the mechanisms, but also in each other. One potential problem here is that the negotiations at the highest level seem to some extent have become personal. There's a sense that one side or the other will win, the other side will lose. That's not the essence of trade. The essence of trade is a voluntary agreement from both sides that both sides believe is in their interest. That's what trade is all about. And I think we need a better recognition that we're trying to make commerce for the benefit of all, not to have an arm wrestling contest so that one can prove to be a winner.
Mr. Kirkgard, now, when it comes to the Trump administration, especially President Trump himself, there is both the necessity in terms of politics to reach a deal, a good deal, at least in the eyes of many of those who vote for him. On the other hand, there's also the vulnerability as a result of an election upcoming in your country? For example, you've been hearing so much about investigation about him, whistleblowers, the recent case about him or against him, not to mention some of the other issues related to him politically. So how vulnerable, if any, progress can be made in this trade negotiation when it comes to the President Trump's own political situation back at home and about the two parties' struggle, which is already spread out all over in your country right now?
Well, I mean, look, there's no doubt that President Trump faces a daunting re-election campaign. It's far from certain that he will succeed. But I think this is really the core of the issue here, because ultimately, if you are China and you're looking at the previous behavior of President Trump, you see what happened to Mexico a couple of months ago. Mexico had a deal, trade deal, a renegotiated NAFTA with the United States, but woke up nonetheless one morning finding out that President Trump, for domestic political reasons, threatened them with ripping up that deal and imposing new tariffs on the border because of immigration. So if you're China, the basic question you have to ask is any deal that President Trump signs with you really worth it? Because, or is the risk that President Trump, as the election campaign heats up, is just basically going to rip it off for domestic political reasons, and you're back to square one? Because if it is the latter, then I believe that it is China's or President Xi's political interest not to necessarily go all out to strike a deal with President Trump, but merely to keep a sort of ceasefire and things from getting worse, and then basically waiting to see what happens in the election, and maybe he will be able to deal with another president come early 2021.
All right. But Mr. Zhu, obviously the Chinese side is still negotiating proactively. The Deputy Finance Minister going to Washington to lay the groundwork for possible early October negotiation is a sign of it. Now, how is China understand about the sophistication of the U.S. politics and also the vulnerability of any deal, if there will be any, under the current circumstances?
Right. That actually is I personally think it's the most tough part, because when we talk about the trade deal, but what I personally suspect is Trump is just treating this trade deal as a weapon, because his main purpose is not to improve the U.S. Trade balance, because what we see in the past few years or months, basically the U.S. trade deficits just keep go larger and large. So the trade deal is the trade tension is definitely not helping. So the problem is, if the Trump just used the trade deal as a weapon to ask China to compromise other things, then probably it will making the deal more difficult, because that probably will threaten the nation's interest.
Right, probably backfire on some of the other aspects of the bilateral relations as well, not to mention all the challenges the relations are already facing right now. Having said that, though, one of the important news we are having for this week, of course, the Fed interest rate cut. So what do you make of it, Mr. Minarick? It is rare that Fed has been doing that, and this time, for the second time already, quite close to one another between the two times. So what do you make of the Fed's decision? Is it more a political sign for U.S. internal consumption, or is it more a decision about the U.S. economy vis-a-vis those of the others?
The Federal Reserve has a reputation of being an impartial, public interest-oriented organization. And I wouldn't exaggerate the notion that these kinds of decisions are rare. The important thing to understand is that changes in interest rates by the Federal Reserve were fairly common. Then we had the financial crisis, and the reason why we haven't had changes since then is simply that interest rates needed to be made lower and kept low so that the economy would recover. The economy has now recovered fairly well, and we will go back to the previous regime of the earlier decades when interest rates are adjusted with some frequency as the economy needs it. Now, in terms of the political environment, I don't believe that the Federal Reserve is being political at all. I believe that what they are trying to do is to make appropriate economic decisions in an environment which is very unusual and very hard to predict. And that's why you see some of the internal discussions there.
You certainly see the unpredictability over there about the future of the economy worldwide. Mr. Kirkegaard, now, despite of the fact that Federal Reserve wants to remain apolitical, we have seen gestures coming from certain political leadership inside your country putting pressure of one kind or another, or influence, shall I say, on the Fed's decision. So what do you think now will Fed's nature, as a result of that, being challenged or questioned by the rest of the world? Even if its letter, the questioned part, is already making things ever more complicated on top of the reality we're already having. Mr. Kirkegaard.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, the reality is that this is not the first time President Trump has directly challenged the Fed on monetary policy, but I think it'll backfire. When President Trump calls for a 200 basis point cut and back to zero immediately, there is actually a case for that. If you were totally focused on inflation expectations and recognize that the Fed has not met its 2% target consistently over the last 10 years, and therefore if you want a symmetric inflation target, you should actually be overshooting, you should have higher than 2% inflation at the moment, then you could make the case that the Fed should cut aggressively immediately. But President Trump calling for it openly clearly makes that case more difficult to make, because if the Fed were to follow this advice, then they would clearly be viewed as doing President Trump's political bidding, even though there are, if you like, fairly strong monetary policy reasons for doing so. So President Trump, in my opinion, as any political leader in the U.S. on monetary policy issues, missed a good opportunity to keep his mouth shut.
Well, before we go, gentlemen, people are looking at and looking for the results of the consultation between the deputy minister level going on right now. But what can we expect the realistic outcome of this consultation leading up to the early October, if there's going to be any negotiation on both sides? Let's go to you first, Mr. Minarek.
I expect that there will be a lot of consultation that will be highly technical, that will have to do with the verification and the remedies if there are any differences. Some of the policy issues, some of the substantive issues that need to be resolved are going to be very contentious. How do we look at U.S. allegations about Chinese use of intellectual property, and how do we deal with the role of state-owned enterprises in China? Those kinds of issues are going to be very, very difficult. You can come up with fair solutions at a ministerial level, but when they go to the principals level, those will require big decisions and major concessions on both sides if they are going to be resolved.
Mr. Kirkegaard, briefly.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be, frankly, anything other than a straight-up quid pro quo, as I said earlier, agriculture for tariff exemptions, an agreement to have a de facto ceasefire at the moment. I personally don't believe that there is any particular willingness to revisit all the difficult technical issues that twice now we have thought we had a deal only for it to be ripped off by the political level. I don't see the political space for a deal to be made on either side before the election.
All right, Mr. Zhu, finally, briefly.
I think things would be very challenging for any structural issue to be settled in the very near term. So from the market perspective and from the economic perspective, I think if the U.S. economy data released in the coming few weeks start to show the signs of weakening, then probably Trump will show some softening tone against the China tariff stuff.
Well, we'll see. A lot of things going on all at the same time. Jimmy Zhu, Joe Millerick, Jacob Kergard. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you so much for helping us understand your perspectives. Have a great weekend. You're watching World Insights with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program. Huawei is suing the U.S. government over its equipment ban. How will overturning the ban affect the trade war? We're going to discuss that after the break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei, the program coming to you live from Beijing. Despite the brief reprieve on tariffs, Washington and Beijing are still at odds over Huawei. The Chinese tech giant is suing the U.S. government, arguing that restrictions placed on the company are unconstitutional. The Trump administration has blocked the U.S. government from buying Huawei gear over allegations of so-called national security risks. Despite headwinds from the U.S., Huawei has accelerated efforts to make its own components, rolling out a new AI processing chip and introducing its latest phone, the Mate 30 series, in Munich on Thursday. But this time around, the world's newest mobile device will not have access to the world's top search engine, Google. Fighting the U.S. restrictions on accessing Google-developed Android, Huawei is developing its homegrown operating system, Harmony OS, for its phones. So how are the U.S. sanctions impacting Huawei? Caught in the middle of the China-U.S. trade brawl, what's the way out for the tech giant from China? For more on that, in Washington, D.C., we have Bruce Fein, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan, joining us in Medford in the U.S. And we have Joe Trachtman, who is a professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Last but not least, in our Beijing studio, Jay Wang, founding partner of J-Stone Capital and former managing director of Intel China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Fascinating topic, particularly with the rolling out of Mate 30, the latest mobile phone coming from Huawei, and the latest mobile phone coming from Apple. So, to you, Mr. Huang, witnessing all the latest development, what do you make of the latest move by Huawei suing the U.S. government?
I think maybe the best defense is offense. I think this is. I think the Huawei's motivation, I'm just guessing about it, is maybe try to find a place, particularly in the U.S. court system, to articulate his case. I think that could be one of the motivation.
Professor Fein, Mr. Fein, tell me more from a constitutional lawyer's perspective. Suing it as unconstitutional, does Huawei have a chance?
Well, there's always some chance, but I think it's remote.
That's very measured in your answer, it seems.
One of the arguments they've made is that this is a bill of attainder, that the sanctions are targeting Huawei. It's a punishment. It doesn't have any remedial effort to it. It really isn't based upon genuine national security. But our courts pay enormous deference to the executive branch whenever national security is uttered. One reason why our U.S. Supreme Court has permitted the building of the wall to go forward. based upon what I think is a bogus national security claim. A more plausible claim is that the President's declaration that this is a genuine national security threat is really phony. President Trump several times has indicated that many of the gestures made against Huawei could go away if he was able to negotiate a deal with China that would eliminate many of our tariffs and quotas currently imposed in exchange for China's opening up its markets, which suggests this really is a political gambit rather than a national security gambit. On that score, I think Huawei has a stronger case, but it's still an uphill battle given the general deference that the courts pay to the executive branch on national security matters. Now, we need to remember also that this case now in Texas is just one of the broader issues concerning Huawei. The United States is also seeking extradition of a chief executive officer from Canada, alleging that she was complicit in violating sanctions against Iran. And that's also a situation where President Trump has indicated, well, that extradition request could go away if there was a broader trade deal negotiated with China. Again, indicating it's politics rather than law that's spurring these particular sanctions.
We have already the constitutional lawyer talking, but Professor Trachtenberg, I want to come back to you as well. When it comes to international law, and international companies operating in different countries and economies. So how do you see this tug of war, quote unquote, between Huawei and the US government, rather, in terms of the scale of business Huawei could do and the kind of partnership Huawei could develop with American businesses and governments, of course?
Yes. Yes. Well, there are three things that the United States is currently doing against Huawei. One is the export controls that apply to Huawei specifically.
Right.
And that's motivated by national security concerns. Another is a limit on U.S. government agencies purchasing from Huawei. And the third is an order by the President that has yet to be fully carried out that would limit the ability of U.S. companies in the telecommunications field from purchasing from Huawei. Now, all of those would raise WTO law issues, World Trade Organization law issues, by virtue of either discriminating against China or by virtue of imposing restrictions on either the import or export side in a way that would violate WTO law. But WTO law has a national security exception under Article 21 of GATT that will probably apply to allow the United States to operate the way that it wishes to here.
That is exactly, Mr. Trachtenberg, Professor, that's exactly the vague part, isn't it? Because the national security issue has been, the meaning of it has been expanded in such a degree that nobody could exactly explain what is national security issue right now in the United States, particularly referring to its relationship with China or Chinese firms. So it's becoming such a vague area, and therefore can be manipulated in whatever way and whatever degree by whoever at any time. So despite the fact WTO could be a very complicated process, how do you see, as a lawyer about international law, on that part?
Well, the WTO has had a decision last year in a case between Russia and Ukraine, where a WTO panel said that they could judge whether the national security claim is real or not and whether it justifies action. I think in this particular case, there is a real national security concern. It may be that the United States will be willing to compromise it, but there's a real concern about cybersecurity in 5G and in Internet of Things. And this is a problem that the United States and China have to work out. And I think that Huawei has to find a way to make sure that its software is verifiable for security.
I think Huawei has so far, Mr. Huang, offered to work with the United States on whatever confirmation that they can do in order to make sure the other side will not have a unfounded suspicion. After all, the national security issue regarding Huawei has not been revealed as to what exactly are the contents of these issues and what evidence the U.S. government has about those concerns. So, Mr. Huang, when you have a situation like this, what do you think it would be the smartest choice that Huawei could have? I mean, on the one hand, obviously the legal actions are already taking place, as we said earlier in our discussion. But what about when it comes to its real business operation, when it comes to its global outreach?
I think if the national security is the real concern, without any political factor in there, this can be easily, in my opinion, resolved. For example, Huawei said multiple times they can open up their source code. People can come to check on every line of the source code. Secondly, for the telecommunications and the equipment, we know they have two parts. One is a core network, which connected to the network. The other one is access network, right, which connect to the core network. Huawei made this very clear. If you suspect that my system has a backdoor, you don't have to buy my core equipment. Right. You can buy my access equipment connected to your core equipment. By doing that, there has no security risk, whatever. So I think this is a so-called security risk. It's just an easy excuse for political purpose. That's my personal opinion.
Now, Mr. Feng, obviously Huawei is trying to develop a different system in order to take the place when it is necessary of the systems that have been accepted all over the world, such as Android, because of the difficulty Huawei could have in the future doing businesses with American companies, Google included. So, Mr. Feng, are you concerned, even though you're a constitutional lawyer by nature, but are you concerned about a world of two or even more totally different technological systems in very different economies? What would that mean for even the national security issue?
Well, I don't know whether it means much for national security. It's obviously going to be more costly for consumers. It's just more expensive because everyone's going to have a different niche rather than the economies of scales come when everyone is operating on the same kind of scheme. So it's going to balkanize, if you will, the market, which makes it, say, more expensive for everyone. I want to go back and underscore what are earmarks of politics rather than law that are at work in this national security declaration of President Trump. First of all, there are other countries that we've approached to try to get them to issue the same kind of sanctions and boycott of Huawei that we have. And several of them had said no. We do have leverage over them because we provide them military and economic security. But there's not a uniform consensus abroad that there is a national security risk. The second is that President Trump himself has repeatedly indicated that he's using national security in order to negotiate trade deals. And he's imposed tariffs and said Canada and the European Union are national security risks and sending us steel or aluminum, which is ludicrous. They're our allies. So when you put all those things together, that's what makes, I think, the national security claim very dubious, and it gives a chance for Huawei in the court litigation.
And finally, gentlemen, every one of you, before we go, 20 seconds if we can, what's going to be, the process we're likely to witness regarding Huawei and its relationship with the United States? Mr. Huang, from a tech perspective.
I would like to see, and we go back to this, Huawei can sell their equipment and to, U.S. and also in Europe, and also can buy the components and like computer chips and etc. from United States and anywhere else.
Okay, and Professor Trachtman?
I think that some of the things that the United States is doing are probably overbroad for the security rationales that are real and could be compromised. For example, many of the export controls on things like Microsoft Windows or Office software don't need to be applied. So there are ways to compromise, and hopefully that compromise will take place in connection with the trade talks that will allow us to trade with one another better. But I think in the long term, there are real cybersecurity issues that our two countries will have to work on in order to continue to trade.
Right. Last but not least, Mr. Fain, please.
Well, I think that the Huawei issue will be resolved in the context of the broader trade negotiations. I am very skeptical of these national security claims stated that the country is going to be crippled if any foreigner has access to some information. I think that that's never been true. It's never been shown that the United States has ever been crippled because of a national security breach. And I would like to see us just stop there and to have a world that's more open and more transparent.
Bruce Fain, Joe Trachtman, Jay Huang, thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Have a great weekend.